So, and what is very important thing to remember is, if the baby is really, really hypoglycemic, less than 20, that is serious enough for the newborn to be, shifted to the NICU. And immediately, if possible, put some how much? 1 teaspoon in 100 ml.
Which one?
10 sugar, glucose. We can put the glucose in the baby's mouth.
For babies, usually if you want to start with the IV infusion, it is always 10% glucose, not 25, because 25 will stimulate more insulin secretion. Already the baby is hyperinsulinemic, and all the problems are because of the hyperinsulinemia. The baby will go for recurrent hypos. Advise them to frequent feeding. The mother has to feed frequently.
That's very important, yes. Within the first half an hour, immediately after the delivery, mother should start feeding the baby. So
and
that
here,
is one.
this baby, because it is IUGR, we don't know whether it is because of the metformin what she has taking or because of the uncontrolled blood sugar. If it because of uncontrolled blood sugar means the severity is little more. So as you said, we don't know whether she has been properly investigated during pregnancy. So you need to see all that. Whether the baby is having any problem. And other than recurrent hypos, it can have also hypocalcemia, hypomagnesemia,
hypocalcemia,
respiratory distress syndrome, all these polycythemia, so many things they can. So you need to complete thorough checkup of the baby, and better to have a pediatrician.
Yes.
In such cases, always with you. Otherwise, also, as you said, majority of the cases, they get delivered in the rural areas where you don't have all the facilities. So you should be ready with all this. Thank you. Now, what is the... Dr. Mary, I want to know whether breastfeeding is important in this child. Lactation.
Very important to breastfeed the child as early as possible. And even the first milk, the colostrum also is an important part of the baby's first feed. Because of that breastfeeding, not only will the child be able to, the infant be able to avoid future problems of obesity and diabetes, the mother too will benefit from a long-term of breastfeeding for the child. So as long as she can breastfeed, it's good for both mother and child.
Thank you. You mean to say that it reverts back all the aberrations, what would have happened for the child as well as the mother because of this gestational diabetes gets reverted once you lactate. And this lactation has to be prolonged as much as they can, so that the mother as well as the child both are prevented from getting diabetes or obesity or whatever problems you say in the adolescent age, later age, all can be prevented by breastfeeding. Lactation is so important. Now, now I want Firdaus to answer what is the contraception you will advise, because already it is IUGR baby. If you don't advise, she'll again conceive all that problems. How will you advise about contraception?
So, with regards to contraception, firstly, we need to counsel the patient on keeping optimal duration in between pregnancy. A minimum of 18 months should be there, as short interval pregnancies within 6 months increases the risk of IUGR and preterm births. Now, there are many types of contraceptive methods which are available. We have the terminal methods, that is the male and female sterilization. I believe our patient is a young patient. She is a 26-year-old female. It's a young family. She may want to conceive again in the future. So this is not a very ideal option for her. Then we have the modern spacing methods. We have the IUDs, we have the daily and the weekly pills, we have the injectables, we have the female and the male condoms and diaphragm. Now, with regards to the WHOMEC guidelines, with respect to GDM, there is no contraindication to the use of any kind of contraception. So, most of the contraceptive methods are considered safe to be used. However, using combined hormonal contraceptives, there is inconsistent data because of the estrogen component in it. It can lead to a decrease in the breast milk production and also increased thrombosis risk. So not to be prescribed immediately postpartum, not in the immediate 6 weeks period. With regards to progesterone-only pills, again, there is conflicting data that some data suggested that it leads to early progression of type 2 diabetes. However, if you think about it, in a short interval pregnancy, in a woman who already has had GDM, the risk of that outweighs the risk of using a progesterone-only pill. So you can very well give POP. It does not hamper breast milk production. And then we have the IUDs, both hormonal and non-hormonal, which are good long-term options. Injectable contraceptives, DMPA, can be given. There is not much report that they cause breakthrough bleeding. And then we have the male and the female condoms, the barrier method, which is there. So most important is we need to advise on pregnancy spacing.
Thank you, doctor. So you mean to say it's not enough if we take care of the mother and baby after delivery and before the next conception. It's an important, we should make her fit to conceive because already she has got problem in this delivery. So advise her, you send her to the physician whom she has been consulting to get proper advice. She has given so many contraceptive methods to choose, the obstetrician has to choose and advise her. She has to get fit to conceive for the next at least and get a better follow-up. Okay, now we will move on to the third case. Here is a 31-year-old gravida 2, para 1, presenting with hyperemesis at 7 weeks of gestation. She had a previous delivery 11 years back, which was a difficult forceps. She had shoulder dystocia, Erb's palsy, a 4 kg weighing baby. Random sugars done after that was normal, so she just left that. And now only she is testing her blood sugar with the glucose. It is 295 and her HbA1c is 7.8. So how will you follow this case? Dr. Alok?
So this is, obviously she is overt diabetes. And what we have missed out is that if you see the previous birth history, she had a large baby, more than 4 kilo, a difficult forceps and shoulder dystocia with Erb's palsy because of brachial plexus nerve injury. And so all this points at fetal hyperinsulinemia, probably because of maternal hyperglycemia. We don't know whether she was overt diabetes at that point of time as well, or she was GDM. Random blood sugar is not a part or protocol of any guideline for screening in the postpartum period or for GDM. So that is one error that has been done. Random blood sugar, it should not have been done. And this patient should have been followed up every year with a OGTT so that we could have picked her up either as a diabetic or a pre-diabetic. And prior to the pregnancy, she should have come for a pre-conception counseling and again screening for diabetes. Maybe then we would have been able to pick up that she is already overt diabetic. And you said HbA1c of 7.8%, which is extremely high. This HbA1c should have been less than 6.5. And the target, had we understood or diagnosed that she is an overt diabetic, we should have first attempted to bring her blood sugar levels to less than, as Madam was saying, less than 110 fasting, between 80 to 110, and postprandial less than 155 at least, which is the ADA guideline. And of course, HbA1c should have been less than 6.5. She should have also been screened for all the other, comorbidities which can occur in overt diabetes, such as she should have been screened for retinopathy, for nephropathy, all of those things. So that
will come, Alok. Now I just want to point out that she has missed GDM. Of course, in the history it comes, she had a big baby, shoulder dystocia, Erb's palsy, weight of the baby 4 kgs, all that. Obviously, it was a GDM, but she was not diagnosed or treated, and follow-up also was very poor. You are giving so many things about postpartum. Nothing has been done, and she was not even getting any preconceptional advice also. Now she is straight away landing at 7 weeks with 7.8 HbA1c and 295 blood sugar. So it's obvious it is diabetes passing through pregnancy. HbA1c for GDM, it is between 5.3 to 6. Above 6 is pre-GDM or diabetes passing through pregnancy. And you know the blood sugar above 200 is diabetes. So now she has become a full-blown diabetic. So how will you manage, Dr. Lily, from now on?
Yes. I think this is a very common scenario that we come across in our practice in the women with diabetes. So definitely, as you rightly said, she's a diabetic who has conceived, and the best thing to do in this scenario is to admit the patient and bring down her sugars as early as possible, and with the insulin, and then counsel her adequately enough and put her, the importance in her mind that she has to be followed up every 15 days thereafter, and check her blood sugars, and so that sugars remain within the normal range. And in the pregnancy, we always look for postprandial less than 120 and fasting less than 95. So this is what we need to achieve, even though she is a type 2 diabetic. And then follow her up as she was saying that look for other complications in this lady, and even if it's first trimester, send her for a retina checkup, or you do it yourself. Look, get a fundoscopy done and to rule out retinopathy, and also urine albumin and microalbuminuria to rule out nephropathy. So these are the two most important complications which can be missed and also can get aggravated because of the pregnancy. So these are the important things that we need to do for this mother, so that we avoid the complications of the pregnancy in the fetus as well as in the mother.
So we have to be very careful. Yes. No, we are going to have furthermore. And
no, ma'am, she's just 7 weeks now. So she's saying 7 weeks. So at 7 weeks, we will just, she's just 7 weeks. Yeah.
So 7 weeks, we don't, no.
8 weeks we do the anomaly scan.
So
anomaly scan, madam, we do 18 to 20 weeks.
I know that. I'm saying in the first visit now, we will not discuss this, is my question to her. Will you discuss that there can be and there may be a chance that you will have to lose this baby, is my question. That's a very tricky question. When we get HbA1c more than 8 and the...
No. Nowadays, every
10.
baby is precious, and it's we need to follow.
Yeah.
I just want to say, I have an IDDM patient. She came last month with an HbA1c of 15.1 conceived.
Okay.
We are following the case by, as you said, we did a scan, everything was normal. So we are continuing, no other go. We can't take a chance like previously we used to say, if it is more than this, don't want all that, we should properly. And as Dr. Lily said, it's a close follow-up. We have to educate her what all can happen about the diabetes, its consequences, and also educate her regarding the follow-up, how to do a SMBG, and as you said, admit and control the blood sugar as early as possible, and most important is further monitoring and follow. That's very important. For that you have to counsel and educate properly. That's very important. Okay, now you have done. I just want to know whether we can use any insulin for this lady.
Okay. I was just wanting to make a point for Dr. Meena when she said that she's, I think, afraid of the medico-legal consequences. So we do need to tell them that you've come at a stage where the sugars are very high, and we will try our best and counsel them properly. I think that was the point. Regarding insulin, this lady definitely needs insulin. There is usually, if we are detecting diabetes in the first trimester, we would give it a try of 2 weeks of medical nutrition therapy. But here the sugars are too high, so she straight away needs to start on insulin. And the acceptable insulin in our scenario, where firstly patient's cost has to be considered, human insulins are totally acceptable. Over and above that, if we need to start analogs, they would be Lispro and Aspart, and also long-acting insulins. Among them, NPH is easily available and safe for the pregnant ladies. Along with that, we can give Detimir also when they can afford it. And we need to start insulin on a certain scale where we look at their sugars, look at the weight of the mother, and then start at, say, 0.7 units per kg body weight in the first trimester, stepping it up as per our experience and looking at the blood sugars. Again, the dose that is calculated has to be divided into a 2/3 and 1/3 at the major meal that she is taking. Again, if it's in the second trimester, this was, I think, 7th week, right? So somewhere around 0.7 to 0.8 units per kg body weight per day, divided into 2/3 and 1/3 dose, would be ideal for her.
Thank you. So, what Madam says that we can use all the human insulins, either it is regular, intermediate acting, all that we can use, mix all 50-50 or 25-70. As far as the analogs are concerned, in a rapid acting, she says Aspart and Lispro are approved, but not Blulicin. That's what you said. And again, in long acting, that is basal, she says we can use Detimir and Deglutec also. But if the patient is already on Glargine, she can continue. Otherwise, do not initiate with Glargine. And Rysodec, so far no adequate studies. We have to wait for it. And so start with any one of this, not any insulin you like. And the main thing what you have pointed out is follow up, monitoring, constant monitoring and uptitration of the dose. And even at starting, as she said, we have to go according to her weight and severity of the blood sugar. We have to decide the dose and uptitrate. That's very important. Just don't leave like this. Okay, now how she, Dr. Mary has started with insulin. Firdaus, how you are going to monitor further?
Okay, ma'am. So for this patient, she has already had a difficult delivery in the past, meaning she was not very thorough with her sugar control at that point of time. So now we have to be very vigilant and very aggressive with her control during this pregnancy. So ideally, we should advise her on a 4 to 6 point SMBG, fasting, 2 pre-meals, 2 post-meal, and a bedtime check. Additionally, if we are keeping her on a very aggressive control, then a 2 to 3 a.m. sample if she has complaints or symptoms of hypoglycemia. Once we know how the sugars are, then we can stagger the test and ask her to do a 4 to 6 point SMBG on a weekly basis, rotating the post-meal checks. In addition to SMBG, we can even use CGM when it is affordable and accessible, which can help in measuring glycemic fluctuations which are linked to macrosomia. However, it is just an adjunct and it should not be replaced for SMBG. SMBG is our main tool in targeting optimal pre and postprandial glucose levels. So the targets again that we are looking at is fasting 95, post-meal 120, which is in line with the DIPSI recommendations. And also when we keep the fasting at or below 95, it reduces the chances of unfavorable outcomes like preeclampsia and macrosomia. Other than that, we have to even monitor her blood pressure, as women with diabetes have a high risk of
that I'll come to it, because now what you're saying is we need to monitor regularly, and what she needs is round the clock, 24/7.
Daily.
I want to say now, it all depends on the response.
Daily.
Yeah, that's what. Again, you see to the response,
And then
and
you
what
stagger
is
the
necessary is 24/7 round the clock control throughout the year in pregnancy. That's very important. So you need not leave her for one meal. You have to, if the blood sugar is under okay control, you can ask her to review one time in the morning, once in the afternoon, once in the night for pre-meal and post-meal. Or else, if the blood sugar is high, you have to go according to that, either all 6 in the same day or weekly once. All this depends on the response and also the blood sugar levels. You have to decide yourself. It is all individualized depending on the response. Okay, now as you have told clearly about the blood sugar monitoring. Sir, yes?
Clarification. Ma'am, DIPSI says 1 hour less than 140 and 2 hours less than 120.
Yeah.
She said rightly, so suppose 1 week you were doing all 6 1 hour, 2 hour, 1 hour, 2 hour, 1 hour, 2 hour. Now the patient is fed up. Now if you are getting good values, you can skip the 1 hour and do the 2 hours because fetal outcomes depend more on 2 hours. Is that?
Fetal outcome, we cannot say the
Most,
problems depend more on 1 hour.
May I add? Ma'am, no one follows this 1 hour, 2 hour, 1 hour, 2 hour.
They do because they are very
Ma'am,
vigilant.
ideally, we should ask patient either you follow 1 hour or 2 hour.
No,
Same.
weekly, na? 1 week, 1 hour, and 1 week, 2 hours.
No. Follow the
No one
same.
follows.
Follow the same. If you are following
Throughout the
2,
pregnancy, you have to follow the same 2
Yes.
hour or 1 hour.
if you want to follow 2, follow every time.
In the beginning, you will try to control both 1 hour less than 140.
No, ma'am.
And
There are
2
no
hours
such
less than
guidelines.
120.
There are no
Anyone.
any of the one, ma'am.
If you are following 2 hours less than 1T, follow the same.
Okay.
Or if you want to follow 1 hour less than 140, follow the same.
After the first bite. 1 hour
Yeah,
after
yeah, yeah.
the first bite
Yeah,
of meat.
yes.
Because somebody may take half an hour to eat, somebody takes 5
Yes,
minutes
yes.
to after the...
So now we have told adequate about the blood sugar. Is that enough, Dr. Alok? We need to do any further investigations in this case because the blood sugar is high, HbA1c also high. You want to do anything, any further investigations?
Yes, some of it has already been covered, I think. First of all, fundoscopic examination and assessment of the retina needs to be done, whether there is retinopathy or not, unless she has already undergone, which is unlikely because she was totally undiagnosed. So, one retinal assessment to rule out retinopathy. And then nephropathy is also another area that needs to be looked into. So we must do serum creatinine and eGFR. We can also do an albumin creatinine, urinary albumin creatinine ratio or 24-hour urine output. 24-hour protein, urinary protein. So if the creatinine is greater than 1.3 and eGFR less than 45, or the albumin creatinine ratio urinary is more than 30, and protein in 24 hours more than 300, I think she should be referred to a nephrologist for further review and assessment. Then both ADA as well as FOXY, they recommend that these women, they can either have hypo or hyperthyroidism. So the assessment of the thyroid function test needs to be done. So you can just do one TSH first, and if the TSH is low, then you can again add a T3 or T4 assessment along with it. You can, at the same time, you can check for tremors or and the reflexes, they need to be seen. Then as you mentioned, ma'am, this patient was admitted with hyperemesis. So whether she is also having neuropathy, autonomic neuropathy, which is causing this gastroparesis and hyperemesis. So that is another area that we can explore and see and rule that out. And also the last childbirth, as you mentioned, was is 11 or 12 years back. So quite a long time, maybe she has been overt diabetic. So I think it will be quite prudent to even do a cardiac assessment for her maybe. So ADA also recommends that age more than 35 or more than 10 to 20 years of diabetes, you better do at least one baseline ECG. And you can also refer her to a cardiologist to see if, so I think.
Yeah, wonderful. What she says is she's coming after 11 years now with a frank diabetes. So investigate her in the first visit for all the complications. Urine routine is a must.
Yes, routine is a must for all antenatal patients. Infection, yes, I agree totally,
But
yes.
protein may
UTI.
be present in normal pregnancy.
Yeah, all that we have to go according to the thing, repeat it 3 times if it is recurring in within 6 months. We have to do microalbuminuria and other further things. But what she is stressing is she has become a full-blown diabetic. So don't just treat her as pregnancy passing through diabetes, but investigate her for full diabetes at the beginning, because all these complications can get worsened. So you first see for the complications and regular follow-up of worsening, and also referral to the specialist if necessary. Okay, what are the problems we can expect in the mother in this case? Dr. Lily?
Yeah, One is, you have to, if depends on, this is the first trimester, but the problems can occur, some problems related to the first trimester, second and third, during the delivery, and postpartum and future. So everything must be monitored. The first trimester, mother can have the various complications that have been mentioned, and they will be detected if all those tests are done. And then second trimester, of course, the mother again can have problems of eclampsia or hypertension can develop during the second trimester particularly, and thereafter go till the end of the pregnancy. And eclampsia is also quite common. And overweight could have been there probably at the time of her weight was mentioned, was it?
No, not mentioned.
Yeah. So she could be overweight and obese. So the problems related to the obesity can also be there. And third trimester, of course, very often these cases will end up in an institutional delivery, and most probably 99% they will end up in the early delivery and cesarean section. And problems related to the cesarean section also can be there. So, during the delivery, the chances of infections may be there, and the sugars can go haywire, even though she was controlled because it's type 2 diabetes. And the sugars have to be monitored intra-delivery and immediately post-delivery as well, and it should be controlled to the normal levels. And what else? The future, of course, she has to be she has to be monitored, and she has to be treated as a diabetic. So the standard protocol for management of diabetes has to be followed in this patient. So, and she needs to be educated to that extent.
So you mean to say it starts from the time of conception till throughout life?
Yes.
In her life. That is, in the first trimester, she can go in for delayed fertility, or she can have miscarriages. Second, she can go for preeclampsia, which is again a feature of insulin resistance. Or in the third, she can go for this thing, preterm labor, difficult delivery, or emergency LSCS. And after that also she can go for postpartum hemorrhage. And then later, very soon she has become diabetic, so you need to follow her as a diabetic. And any time during delivery, you have to watch for all the complications getting worsened. So in this way, the mother is affected and we need to follow her. Okay, mother is okay. Now we are done with mother. Now what about the fetus? Whether it will have any problem, Dr. Firdaus? Or Dr. Mary or Firdaus? Dr. Mary, sorry.
Yes, the fetus, because this particular case came at 7 weeks, I think, with a sugar of 295.
Yes.
So already a lot of damage has been done. Because in the first, up to the 7 weeks, you have the organogenesis, and so we would probably, as Dr. Meena said, alert the lady that she could have problems of congenital defects in the baby, particularly atrial septal defects, ventricular septal defects, coarctations, cleft lip, also cleft palate, and then neurology, you would also look for anencephaly or hydrocephalus, and then urogenital systems get affected, as also the gastric, where you get atresia and anorectal atresia too. So there are a whole lot of complications, and once the baby, and during that period of second and third trimester, large for weight babies would probably have problems after the delivery, when they will have maybe in the first few hours, maybe hyperbilirubinemia or hypoglycemia, hypomagnesemia, all these problems could occur. And then, of course, in the future is again obesity and diabetes facing that child if not taken care of.
So again, the baby is also going to have in every trimester, that is at the time of, because she was having hyperglycemia during conception itself, you are saying that she can have very well some congenital anomalies, what all she has mentioned. And in the second, she can go for, the baby can go in for some congenital abnormalities, behavioral abnormalities. And in the third, of course, the growth is mainly affected. Either the baby will be macrosomic or IUGR. Here, mostly you have to watch for IUGR. And once the baby is born, it can have early childhood obesity, IGT earlier, and diabetes very early in later life. Yes?
Ma'am, I have few questions. First of all, that many study has suggested that 1 hour PP value is a better predictor of the advanced pregnancy outcome than the 2 hours PP. So do you think that the short acting, particularly the short acting analogs, is a better choice, or do they have some advantages here? Second question is that in GDM, in maximum cases, we found it is the postprandial hyperglycemia rather than the fasting hyperglycemia. So how frequent you prefer the long-acting analogs rather than the conventional things? And another question is that in many physicians, they prefer that the premixed insulin twice daily before breakfast and before dinner, and if it is not controlled, then sometimes they add a short-acting analog, say, before lunch. My question is that
I'll come out with that.
Not preferable
Yeah,
to
as you said, usually in outside pregnancy, what we say insulin is 50% basal, 50% bolus, all that. But here in pregnancy, postprandial abnormality is very high. So it is not like what we say 50%, 50%. We need more of bolus insulin. What you say mixtures will help only in mild cases. 2 times mix all that. But in real diabetes in pregnancy, we need bolus for each meal with the basal. That's only a proper treatment during diabetes in pregnancy. It all depends on the monitoring, how they respond. We start with mix, as you said. If they are not getting controlled at any time, that is in the morning or afternoon or night, we keep watching all 3 times. There we add the bolus. Again, the older actrapid, that is the regular insulins, they take 30 to 40 minutes to get dissociate into monomer. In that, it's better to go for analogs. Even in analogs, FASP, the fast-acting aspart is more physiological, coinciding with the endogenous insulin secretion, that is better. So as you said, the one postprandial raise is very well taken by FASP, the fast-acting aspart. But otherwise, if the patient cannot afford, you please advise them properly that it has to be taken 30 minutes prior to food.
And madam, last question. If the patient is not on metformin, should you consider in any stage of
you can very well take, if the insulin dose is increasing very much, you can add metformin.
Madam, up to what dose, or what is the...
So actually, the present, what we are doing, according to my teacher, mentor, godfather, Dr. Seshia, he is doing on studies on primordial prevention, where what he says that 110 at 8th week of pregnancy. Why this 110? This 110 is the fetal renal threshold. Like how we have 180 adults, for fetus it is 110. Once the blood sugar of the mother crosses 110, as Dr. Lok said, the fetal pancreas starts secreting insulin. That's what she mentioned. So if 110 you see, we are starting on metformin. The study is going on everywhere in Delhi, Bhopal, Chennai, and again Dr. Jayant has taken at Bhubaneswar. Many places they have taken, and we have shown that this 110, those who had 2-hour postprandial 110, when we followed them without intervention, 90% of them developed GDM. Again, the other one, we intervened with metformin right from 8th week, so that the blood sugar of the mother is not crossing 110 or not stimulating the fetal pancreas, because initially all the problems, those who get GDM are already hyperinsulinemic. Those ladies only will go in to develop GDM. So later what happens if the fetal handling starts, the fetus takes over the process and it stimulates insulin. So main thing is hyperinsulinemia is the cause. So we are starting on metformin, and it has been approved right from conception to delivery. And we have got adequate evidence I can show a paper what I'm having also. Even 1936, he is mentioning he has done in 20,000 cases with metformin, nothing has happened, and he was calling a magic miracle pill. So metformin, nothing happens during pregnancy, it can be given. About?
The fetus is being affected. Later on in their life, when they are more than 5 years of age, the obesity incidence goes up, and there is male fetus are getting affected, their testes also. So saying this that in scientific forum,
Sir,
that
very recently I will give you the evidence. UK, they have approved a metformin from conception to delivery.
but there is a question mark. Recently, very recently, there are data to say otherwise. The obesity incidence.
What you said was there. I am aware of it. What you that later they are getting obesity, the circumference increasing,
the
all
fetus,
that. But
male fetus, the male offsprings, they are getting affected, their testes. So the sperm count goes down. So needs to look.
May I add, sir? So what you are talking about is MIG tofu trial.
Yes.
And in
Rutul, mic.
but yeah, am I audible? So sir, in MIG tofu trial there were only 200 patients, and it is old trial, very old. After that we have yes, and now we have newer data as well as newer approval, as well as in our Indian government guidelines, Ministry of Health, they have also approved metformin after 20 weeks in almost all the patients.
But here
on the
we are
basis of
saying
safety
8
only.
weeks.
yeah, we are. I will show that to you. Very recently, it has been
Here
approved.
the question is different.
Yeah, I got it.
8 weeks of.
Sir, and again, I want to say you, obstetricians, they are used adequately, thousands and thousands.
We have used it for PCOD very frequently.
But
We have used it.
PCOD, now the latest guidelines say you need to stop it.
Sir, our mentor will answer
Continue
this.
in the first trimester, it is to be continued.
Yes, it is to be continued.
Yes.
Just a minute.
Yes.
The speakers requested me to keep silent during the program for my lack of knowledge, but Vijay Patni is requesting me for the final opinion here. Metformin is not teratogenic. Metformin is not producing any problem. All the data shown around small data, the largest MOMPOT data, and many data has shown that metformin is not producing any abnormality. Stray data are coming. I don't know whether these are generated by insulin companies or not. Insulin, if you give, will increase the insulin resistance both in the mother and the fetus. Metformin hits at the root cause of the pregnancy diabetes, which is insulin resistance, both maternal and fetal. If you give metformin from the very beginning, then that insulin resistance factor, the etiological factor, is controlled. Give insulin more and more, there will be more and more insulin resistance. If you give metformin in future, chances of all the features of insulin resistance like obesity, coronary artery disease, diabetes, then nephropathy, all other complications both in the mother and the child is less, including obesity. There are stray data. I'm sorry, Bridge, I can't be with you. These are all old data. Just a minute. European guideline has approved metformin. Australian guideline has approved metformin. Only India, they have approved from the second trimester because of lack of data for the first trimester. In polycystic ovary, metformin, if you stop, chances of abortion is 36 to 38%. So what will offer? Abortion or query metformin-induced teratogenesis. Multiple data are coming, I can send to anyone. Metformin is non-teratogenic. For legal issues, those who are on metformin, if you just, and also metformin lowers the doses of insulin requirement. So all the side support insulin. Insulin treatment produces atherosclerosis, more chances of cerebral stroke, more chances of nephropathy. Insulin only lowers the blood sugar, do not do anything good. And if metformin used from the very beginning, I again repeat, it is the insulin resistance. both in the mother and the fetus. No objection, legal issue. If you think patient may take you in the court, give a written consent. I do not want to continue metformin. Understanding well, there will be some problem. Policies took over. If you stop, chances of abortion is 36%.
It has to be continued.
If you continue, the chances are more lower. After first trimester, this is your choice. And insulin, I am very much fond of fast acting aspart in GDM, not in pre-gestational GDM. GDM is a disorder of abnormality of the first phase of release. We want very quick lowering of the blood sugar. Degludec has been approved. Probably Bhavatan is hesitant about Ryzodec. Ryzodec is a combination of aspart and Degludec. Both are applicable. And for the 30-70 preparation insulin, the question what was raised, these are not applicable for all levels of hyperglycemia. It is very high or there are more postprandial peaks, then you will have to use short acting. And monitor every day fasting and 2 hours, and if possible before each meal. 1 hour, 2 hour gives same result in terms of fetal outcome and also in terms of A1C. Don't confuse the patient, do 2 hours. How many days? Depending upon the situation. Ideal 3 before each meal, 3 2 hours after each meal, 1 at midnight 3 am. For the Somogai phenomena, that is not required. Routinely we have done and published 1 fasting, 3 after 2 hours each meal. Initially every day, according to response, alternate day or every third day. These are very good. A1C should be brought down below 6. One thing you missed, there should be an examination of serum lipid in cases of pre-gestational diabetes. Because if there is lipotoxicity, there will be problem to the fetus and the mother in terms of the pancreas, etc. No anti-lipid lowering agent is approved in pregnancy. Only if triglyceride is more than 1000, gemfibrozil is allowed to avoid cerebral infarct and pancreatitis.
Thank you, sir. I thank all my panelists and also the delegates with the concluding remarks of our mentor, Dr. Samar Banerjee.
One thing I like to say that recent 2024 guidelines ADA say that insulin is the drug of choice, not the metformin.
Recent paper published in Lancet, even in Harrison, majority of the guidelines are written and published by authors by incentive from the company. This is my belief. So even in Lancet, just a minute, in the hypertension guideline, it has been mentioned only the automatic machine should be used. The practice which you are doing for a long time by listening to the sound, they have done everything wrong. Is it correct that machine will give the results? Same result for everyone and correct one? Machine will never be abnormal? I think these are all pushed by money.
Thank you, sir. Thank you all. Sir, let us have our own guidelines, not American and Russian or Canadian.
Let Bridge go to USA. We Indian are Indian, will remain Indian, and let us practice Indian policies which are affordable. Thank you.
What our teacher has taught us, Indian problems need Indian research and Indian solution.
I do agree to that, but science should prevail. It should not be non-scientific communication from the dais.
Because we'll move on to the next session on diabetes complication and comorbid. And our first speaker for this session is Dr. Manoj Srivastava. Please, if you could come on to the dais.
So I think we can skip the slide. Slide is there?
So in this session, there are 4 topics that will be dealt by 4 speakers. So the first topic is diabetes and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, the pathophysiology, diagnosis and management strategies. And it will be dealt by Dr. Manoj Srivastava. So,
thank you, Chairpersons. The topic diabetes and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is a very vast topic, and looking at the subtopic, the pathophysiology, the diagnosis and the management strategy, I think it is really a big topic which probably would require more than 2 sessions to cover it. But due to the paucity of time, I would like to restrict myself to NAFLD happening in type 2 diabetes and what are the recent changes that have happened in the last few years. So how do we define the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease? First of all, you must remember it's a multi-system disease. So now it has come out of the realm of gastroenterology and the hepatology into the realm of metabolic physicians. This is one thing that should be very clear. And the definition is basically a histopathological definition, which shows that when there are more than 5% hepatocyte showing steatosis, then you make a diagnosis of fatty liver disease. And along with that, if you want to make it a non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, then you have to show that the patient is not taking sufficient amount of alcohol. So it was primarily a definition of exclusion. But now, very recently, it has become a more positive definition. And we're going to go to that in the next slide. And this NAFLD, when it is associated, again, it's a histopathological diagnosis, along with inflammation and hepatocyte injury, then it is known as NASH. Looking at the prevalence of NAFLD, nearly 25% of the population all over the world would be suffering from NAFLD. And a potentially progressive form of NAFLD, that is NASH, nearly 12 to 14% would be having it. If you are obese, there are chances that 25% to 30% of you would have NASH. And recent study has shown that 70% of patients with type 2 diabetes would have NAFLD, and only 30 to 40% of them would have a more aggressive form, that is NASH. So now there has been a major change in the nomenclature, and we need to remember these new terminologies. All the steatotic liver disease, which will be labeled as patients having a histopathologically more than 5% of the hepatocyte showing steatosis, then you'll call it a steatotic liver disease. You have a more positive definition, which was earlier an definition of exclusion. Now we have a metabolic dysfunction associated steatotic liver disease, or MACLD. And then, of course, we have the alcohol associated liver disease, that is ALD. And then there are patients who have metabolic syndrome, plus they're also taking alcohol. So there's a combination. And if these patients have fatty liver, then you'll have to call them as a metabolic alcohol associated liver disease, or MET-ALD. So these are three different definitions now. MET-ALD could be MASLD predominant if the alcohol content is less, or it could be ALD predominant if the alcohol content is more. And the alcohol content has been mentioned here. 20 grams in female or 30 grams in male per day, of 140 milligram in females and 210 milligrams in female. If it is less than that, then it's got to be MASLD predominant, even if the patient is taking alcohol. One must remember that there's still a big chunk of patients with other liver diseases that needs to be excluded before we make a diagnosis. So when we have to make a diagnosis of metabolic associated steatotic liver disease, then there are three basic criteria. Either the patient is obese with a BMI of more than 25, in Asians a BMI of 23, or type 2 diabetes. If you have these two basic criteria, then you label your patients of fatty liver disease as cases of metabolic associated fatty liver disease. If the patient is lean or normal weight, then again you have to look at at least two metabolic risk abnormalities before you label them as patients of MACLD. So what happens if you have fatty liver disease? Your risk of developing type 2 diabetes goes 2 times higher. And if you get diabetes with NAFLD, then your risk of developing a lot of complications also go up. What if you have type 2 diabetes and then develop NAFLD? Now, if you have type 2 diabetes and develop NAFLD, then the progression of NAFLD is very fast, a very aggressive form, right from steatohepatitis to liver fibrosis to end-stage liver disease. So you have the healthy liver, the simple steatosis where the hepatocytes are less than 5%, MASH, which is the equivalent of NASH, where the associated inflammation, steatosis, ballooning, inflammation, and fibrosis. And then there are, of course, cirrhosis, and then the hepatocellular carcinoma. What are the factors which will associate with MACLD progression? Not all of them would progress to the same rate. So there are certain genetic factors. PNPLA3 and TM6SF2. These are two genetic markers which will suggest that these patients will tend to develop a more aggressive form of steatosis. Environmental factors, diet, gut microbiota, and then if you have diabetes, obesity, and if you have already a cardiovascular disease, the risk of progression of the NAFLD would be faster. Of course, we remember the multiple hit theory. The first hit is the fat deposition, the primary cell involved is hepatocyte, the second hit is the inflammation, the Kupffer cells are involved, and lastly the fibrosis where the stellate cells are involved. What actually happens? Just a slide on the pathophysiology. Now, patients will have some sort of an adipocyte dysfunction, so they tend to release more of free fatty acid into circulation. Then in case they have insulin resistance, as you know, the insulin is an anti-lipolytic hormone. So if there's less of insulin or the insulin is not working well, there's more of lipolysis, more free fatty acid in circulation. And then if the patient tends to eat more of fat in the diet, again, all of them will tend to form, will cause excessive free fatty acid in circulation. When this excess free fatty acid enters into the liver, what actually happens? Normally the free fatty acid is oxidized, partly is stored as triglycerides, and some of them is then thrown out into circulation back in form of triglyceride-rich lipoprotein. But when there's excessive amount of free fatty acid, the beta oxidation is overwhelmed. And especially if the mitochondria are not functioning very well, then what will happen? Then this beta oxidation of fatty acid is incomplete. And when this happens, lot of toxic intermediaries are formed. And these toxic intermediaries are what is responsible for the inflammation and steatosis. So what actually happens? The hepatocyte, in a form of a protective mechanism, converts these free fatty acid, instead of going into the oxidative process, into a storage form of triglyceride. And then you have the NAFLD. But remember, the free fatty acid, the toxic intermediaries, they are responsible for the progression of the disease, leading to inflammation, apoptosis, and fibrosis. Here, a poor mitochondrial function is very important, and it leads to a lot of reactive oxygen species being released. There's endoplasmic stress, reticulum stress, which causes an unfolding protein response, and all of them lead to a lot of apoptosis and damage to the liver cell. Coming on to the management of NAFLD, the following recommendation I have taken up from the ACE guideline 2022. There has been little changes in 2024, and this has been along with the co-sponsorship of American Association of Study of Liver Disease. So how do we diagnose NAFLD? We need to show hepatic steatosis, lack of significant alcohol consumption, defined as ongoing or recent alcohol consumption of more than 21 standard drinks per week for men, and more than 14 standard drinks per week for women. And of course, a very important concept is there should be exclusion of other liver diseases. And these are the secondary causes of hepatic steatosis. A very important cause is hepatitis C, especially genotype 3, which needs to be, whenever you have hepatic steatosis, try to rule out that these patients may not be suffering from hepatitis C virus infection. Other conditions are not so common, but of course, acute weight loss or malnutrition can also cause fatty liver disease. How do we diagnose steatosis? How important it is to diagnose steatosis? The imaging diagnostic method is ultrasound is the most common one, but the problem is the ultrasound will diagnose the steatosis only when the steatosis goes beyond 30%. The diagnosis happens at 5%, but the ultrasound will detect it by 30%. So there's huge margin of hepatic steatosis which is not detected by ultrasound. Computerized tomography is better, but then because of the radiation problems, this is not considered as a screening tool. CAP, or the controlled attenuation parameter, is a very good methodology. It detects steatosis up to 10%. So, but still not to the 5% mark. Magnetic resonance imaging, MRS, MRI estimated proton intensity fat fraction, they are newer diagnostic methodologies, expensive, not available everywhere, but they can detect up to 5.56% hepatic steatosis. So very near to what the definition of steatosis is. There are certain biomarkers for steatosis, but then they have not been validated fully as far as the histopathology is concerned. So we can just leave it out. Steatohepatitis, again, very difficult to diagnose. It can be diagnosed only on the basis of a liver biopsy. Ultrasound cannot differentiate between steatosis and steatohepatitis. Another important thing is elevated aminotransferase level. Yes, this is a very good indicator, but remember that aminotransferase may be normal throughout the course of the NAFLD. Even in late stages of advanced fibrosis, the transaminases may be normal. So they're not very, very sensitive tests to be done. Fibrosis, again, liver biopsy is again the final answer. It is the gold standard. The stage of fibrosis, you start initially with the pericellular fibrosis, the perisinusoidal, then periportal fibrosis, and then bridging fibrosis necrosis. There's a slight difference between what actually happens in the hepatotropic type of fibrosis, where it is primarily starts off with the periportal fibrosis, but here it happens perisinusoidal first. The non-invasive diagnostic tests are preferred and advisable in people with type 2 diabetes. The serum biomarkers are very important. The aspart aminotransferase to platelet ratio index, the APRI score, the NAFLD fibrous score, the ELF score, and the most important of them is FIB-4 score. Amongst the imaging, we have the transient elastography and the magnetic resistance elastography. Whom should we screen for NAFLD? Remember, the problem is not the fatty liver, the problem is the fibrosis in the fatty liver. So just diagnosing fatty liver is not going to help you. We are interested to know whether this fatty liver has got some degree of fibrosis or not, and that is where we have to act. So remember, patients with obesity or features of metabolic syndrome, patients with pre-diabetes and type 2 diabetes, hepatic steatosis on imaging study, or persistently elevated plasma aminotransferase. If any of these things are positive, that means you can have simple obesity, you don't have to check for hepatic steatosis by an ultrasound, you don't have to do an aminotransferase. Simple obesity, you have to go ahead, take it for granted that it has got steatosis, and there's no need to check for steatosis, go for checking for fibrosis. Similarly, in pre-diabetes and type 2 diabetes, you don't have to worry about steatosis, goes directly towards the advanced fibrosis or fibrosis by doing a FIB score. So the other test that we're talking about, hepatic steatosis, is not required in most of the situations. So screening for fibrosis in diabetes, what are the recommendations? In persons with type 2 diabetes, clinicians should consider screening for clinically significant fibrosis using the FIB-4, even if they have a normal liver enzyme level. So you don't have to worry about the liver enzyme, you don't have to worry about the ultrasound. All patients of type 2 diabetes should be subjected to a FIB-4 scoring.